this is really such a great opportunity. I don't really get to speak to other Kansas authors, and I'm really excited to be here. First of all, to meet all of you as Kansas authors, and to find out a little about all of you and what you do and what you write. So one of my earliest memories is being home with my mom, and my favorite show was a show called Thumbelina. It was a fairy tale theater show. It was Shelley Duvall was the host, and so it was one of my favorite things to watch on TV. And so one of my first books that I wrote was called Thumbelina, starring Carrie Fisher, which was the title of my book. And I still remember drawing that book and stapling it together and being like, how do they make real books? You know, like I want my book to look like a real book. And so I think from that very young age, I was really interested in storytelling, and I was interested in kind of fantastical stories. Thumbelina, you know, about this little girl who's the height of a thumb, and she goes on these adventures. And so I think from that young age, I was just kind of inspired to write things with a little bit of a fantastical twist. As I got older, one of my uncles, he was my Uncle Larry, he started writing Westerns. And I was probably 12 or 13 when he started publishing his Westerns. And he took it upon himself to organize me and two of my sisters and some of his children to have a writing class. And so we did that. We did maybe 3 or 4 writing classes together. I wasn't super interested in writing. I think I had written a few short stories, but the idea of writing an entire book was a little daunting for me. But in that class, he challenged us to write a whole book. And I'm coming from this perspective where I had just wrote 10 pages of a short story. And to me, that was a lot. Like, that's a lot to write. And I don't, you know, it takes months and months, sometimes years to write a book. But his advice stayed in the back of my head for the next, you know, decade or so. He ended up becoming an agent, and I submitted a short story to him called The Quest for the Spear. And he actually wrote me a letter, mailed it, put it in the mail, made it look official from the Franklin Literary Agency. And he said he really enjoyed reading my book. He said I had a great voice for young adult novels, and he encouraged me to keep writing. So that was really uplifting and promising for me at a young age, to be able to have that kind of encouragement. And I think that's maybe something that we could all, I know myself personally, I've got 5 children, and you know, they're all interested in various different things. I've got 4 boys and 1 girl, and my boys are mostly interested in like high-tech military sci-fi kind of things. Not exactly my cup of tea, but you know, I try to support them as much as possible. And recently I've been writing a book with my youngest child, he's 7. And let's see, it's Buzz Lightyear versus the Lizard Man. So we've been writing that one together, and apparently the Lizard Man is actually the Lizard King, who wears a stinky cheese crown. Nobody can get near him because he smells so bad. Anyway, so my Uncle Larry to me was the person who really put that spark of imagination that made me later on in life start writing. So fast forward a few years, my mom was also a big influence on me. As children, she read The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis to us, and then that kind of got me started into like really enjoying to read fantasy. And then I read some other fantasy books. In my teen years, I would get these ideas for fantasy stories, and I would have maybe like an image in my head. So one of the images was this girl, older teenage girl, standing on a cliff, and a dragon flying up to her as she's standing on the cliff. So it's just kind of an image I had that I wanted to put in a book. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna write that book. So she started out in the orphanage. She got picked up by the Druids, and they go on this quest. They go to a beach, they go to a forest, they go to an inn, but I never made it to the mountain. And I never worked in the story that there were dragons. And so I would give up because I would get frustrated and be like, okay, well, this story is obviously not going where I wanted. You know, I get maybe a quarter of the way into the story and just, it wouldn't be fun anymore because it's not what I had pictured in my head. It just went, I wanted it to go this direction and it just went totally this way. So fast forward, I had gotten married. My husband told me he wanted to be a doctor. We were going to have to go to medical school, and medical school for 4 years, residency for 5 years, or no, yeah, medical school 4 years, residency 5 years, fellowship another year. And all this while, well, we started out with 1 kid, and by the time he got to residency, we had 3 kids, ages 1, 3, and 5. So at this point in my life, we were living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was doing his residency training in general surgery, which meant that he was working 80 hours or more a week. I had graduated college with a degree in English. I had planned to become a teacher, but I decided to stay home with my 3 young kids instead. But I was losing my mind. It was hard. It was harder than I expected. I had 2 in diapers, and it was just kind of chaotic. And I thought, I need a creative outlet. Like, what happened to me? I didn't even recognize myself. I was just this machine who's changing diapers and doing dishes and folding laundry. So I had a friend loan me a book called The Princess of the Midnight Ball. It's by an author called Jessica Day George, and it was a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale. And I read it, and it just brought up all these memories I had had of being a kid watching Thumbelina and the other fairy tale theater shows, and just loving those fairy tales so much and having ideas in my head. Like when I was a teenager, the girl standing on the cliff with the dragon coming up. And my thought was, I've had these stories stuck in my head for years and years and years. And I thought, well, if I'm going to write a book, I'm going to wait until I'm retired, or wait until, you know, wait until the right time. And then in her bio at the end of the book, she said she wrote the book while she had 2 young children. And I thought, oh my goodness, okay, if this author can do it, then I'm going to do it too. I didn't have any idea how I was going to do it, because at that point I couldn't even check my email without having little hands, you know, grab my fingers off the keyboard. But I was determined, and I had a lot of support from my husband, David, who also wants to write books, but he's not at a point in his life where he can do that right now. But anyway, he got on the internet and he said, okay, if you really want to write a book, you've got to write 65,000 words. And I thought, okay, that's a lot of words, but I'm going to try to do it. So every day I sat down, actually back up. Before I started writing my book, I thought, I don't want the same thing to happen when I was a teenager, when I had this image in my head and I started to write and it didn't go where I wanted. I need an outline. Now, I know some of you are probably, you know, the term pantsters and plotters. You write by the seat of your pants, so you don't have an outline, or you're a plotter and you have a really strict outline. So I decided, even though I didn't know the terms at the time, but I decided that I was a plotter. And so I sat down, and the first thing I did was I wrote an outline, and it ended up being an 11-page outline. And after I wrote dialogue, I wrote character profiles. I wrote it was this story took place in a little town in Texas called Jefferson, Texas, back in 1877. It's a lot different than the books that I write now, but and it had a fantastical twist to it though. So I sat down after I wrote that 11-page outline, and I wrote my book, and I finished it in a month. Now, keep in mind, it was just, pardon the term, but it was word vomit. It was just me putting words on a page. It was it was this freeing experience. I just felt so like energized and excited. And every day I would wake up thinking about my book, what I want to write in my book. And I wasn't thinking about publishing or anything. My goal was to write a book, to finish a book. And so I did, and I wrote it in a month. And after I wrote it, I'm like, okay, I wrote a book. Now what? And so luckily my husband kept encouraging me the whole time. Around Christmas time, he bought me 4 or 5 books on the craft of writing, which I thought, oh, that's garbage. I've already written a book. I already know how to write. I don't need these books. But I read them anyway, and I learned that I knew nothing, basically. But I started, again, my husband got on the internet and he said, okay, here's what you need to do next. You need to write another book. And I'm like, wait a minute, whoa, I just wrote one whole book. That was a lot. So I learned about the querying process. I started querying that book, and I started working on my second book, which was a sequel to my first one. Also took place in Jefferson, Texas, but in the 1920s with the grandchildren from the first book. And then I started writing, I finished my second book, started writing my third book, and I thought, man, 3 books. I've got to get published now. You know, like I've written 3 books. No publisher's going to turn me down. I went to writing workshops. Y'all might be familiar with William Bernhardt. He's a writer down in Oklahoma City. But at the time, I went to a 5-day workshop, which was really intense. And you would take your manuscript, and he would lecture during the day. And then in the evenings, you would turn in your pages to there was about 5 to 10 people in the class. You would turn in your pages to them and swap editing each other's work. It was intense, but I learned so much from it. So by that time I had finished 3 books. I started working on a 4th book. And at that time also, William Bernhardt, who had taught the lectures I was telling you about, had started writing serialized ebooks to put on Amazon. So they were short ebooks that would come out every month. And he invited some of his past writing students to also write in the same world. It was called Shine, and it was about young women who had superhero powers. It was kind of like X-Men, but it was just the women who had the powers. And so I wrote 4 just novellas for that. So that's the first time I got anything published. I remember the first time getting on Amazon. Y'all probably had this experience too, searching my name and seeing my name come up with a book, and with a book with my name on it. And that was just, I'm sure y'all understand, but that was just an amazing feeling to see, finally, I've got my name on a book online. And so that was a really exciting experience for me. And I really enjoyed writing those books, but it did kind of feel like they were half mine and half his, because I was writing my books in his world. And so, but it was a good experience for me to go through, because it kind of introduced me to the world of publishing, which is a whole different beast from writing. You've got your writing side of the craft, the craft of writing and learning how to improve in your writing, all this. And now I was introduced to publishing and what works in publishing, what doesn't work in publishing. Publishing to me, it's just a necessary evil, but and I was still querying. I finally finished my 4th book, and as I was going through this publishing process, I thought, I can't get an agent, but there's other publishing houses out there who don't require an agent, who are actually pretty good. So I submitted my book, Dream Thief, to 2 of those. But I had whittled it down to 2 publishing houses that I thought were really good, who didn't require an agent. So I sent my query letters to both of them. The next day, I had both of them asking for a manuscript. Turned that in. The next day, the one that I didn't like quite as much sent me an offer. And I'm like, that's really exciting. They sent me an offer, but it wasn't quite the company I really wanted. But that gave me leverage to email the company that I really wanted to be like, hey, this other company is sending me a contract. Have y'all made up your mind yet? So I waited all day. Finally, at 11 p.m. that night, I checked my email and they had sent me a contract. So I was really excited. I had met this publisher at a writing conference previously. They were really nice and I really connected with them. And I had even sent them my third book, which they had rejected. So that's why I was like on the fence, like, I don't know if they're going to want this fourth book that I wrote. It was a totally different from my third book. My third book was also set in Jefferson, Texas, modern day. But my fourth book was set in Houston and Galveston and in Fairy World. So that ended up being my first published full-length novel, Dream Thief, which went on to win several awards. My publisher tried to put all the awards on my cover and it looked really gaudy. And I'm like, can we just narrow it down to 2 awards? They're like, oh, okay. So we narrowed it down to the two most prestigious, I guess, awards, which was a first place Rowan Award and a first place Book of the Year forward reviews. So this turned into a 7-book series, which is set up over here. So this was about a Fairy World MD therapist. So she lives in Houston helping people who have gone to this place called Faithander, which is a fairy world with dragons and magic and elves and pixies. And her father is half elf. Her father is elf. Her mother is human. So she's half elf, half human. And she can help people who go to Faithander and come back to Earth. When they come back to Earth, they lose all their memories of what happened in Faithander. And since she's from both worlds, she can remember everything that happens in both worlds. So she can help them get their memories back. So that's her day job. In this book, her godson gets kidnapped by the Dream Thief. And she has to go on this quest through Faithander to try to get him back. And this one turned out to do really well. It's still selling. I published it back in 2015. So after I published this, it's called the Fairy World MD 7-book series. I went through this period of what's next? Because I had just written this 7-book fantasy series. So after the 7-book series, I wrote a fairy tale retelling called The Witch's Tower, which is a retelling of Rapunzel. But it's not about Rapunzel, it's about the witch. But she's a good witch, and she's actually trying to help Rapunzel get out of the tower. So this turned into a trilogy. With the second book is The Dragon Swan Princess, and the third book is a Rumpelstiltskin retelling called Rumpel's Redemption. So these were really fun to write. These are geared more like to an adult audience. They're clean, but the main character she's 24 and she's got a medical degree, so it's geared to a more adult audience. These are young adult. So this is more for like your teenagers. And then after that, I'm like, okay, I guess we all go through different periods in our writing careers. We have the period where we're just writing, we're learning the craft of writing and learning the best ways of writing dialogue and writing, how to make your characters stronger and things like that. And then we go through this phase of, okay, now I've gotten that down. Now I'm going to start publishing. What's the best way to start publishing? Well, I can get an agent and try to go for one of the big 5 publishers. I could go the route of getting a smaller publisher who doesn't require an agent. I can self-publish where I can control, my edits and my cover. So, I mean, that's a question we all have to ask at some point. So after I had published 10 books with Clean Team, I thought, well, maybe I should try again to get an agent. You know, maybe I'm at a point where I could do that again. So it just so this is a cautionary tale, by the way. Let's see. So I wrote a book called The Seventh Fly, and it was more science fiction than fantasy than what I usually write. But it was kind of like Dream Thief in a way, where there were two different worlds. There's Earth and another reality. And in The Seventh Fly, the idea was this ship back in the 1800s was filled with Scottish immigrants, and it had crashed on an island, and they had found a portal into another world. And so that other world kind of had magic and stuff, and they grew from that initial shipwreck. They grew into their own civilization, but it was influenced with a lot of Scottish culture. So I wrote that book, and I started querying it, and got the usual responses, like just not for us, not right for us. Well, I had a friend at the time who was an agent's assistant, and then she became an agent. And it was kind of weird because she was my friend. And looking back on it, I think I realize now why friends and agents don't make the best relationships. But she really liked my book, though, and she knew that I had written a lot of books, and she knew I had more books to come. So she took me on as her client, which I was super excited about because I finally had an agent, which is something I've wanted forever. And she started submitting proposals for The Seventh Fly. At the same time, I had written another book called Never Call Me Vampire, which is a different kind of take on the vampire stories. My idea was that the vampire, instead of living in shadow and nobody knows who he is, he lives in this kind of mental facility where he has to get blood transfusions, and he's very, very popular and well known, but he's also very disliked by half the population and loved by the other half of the population. So anyway, The Seventh Fly and Vampire were two kind of different stories, definitely different than my Dream Thief story of Witch's Tower. And she started submitting proposals for those. And after I had written those two books, I had a dream on Mother's Day while I was taking a nap. And it was this fantastical world where the hero all the heroes had died, and the Dark Lord comes back. There's no heroes left. And so this one young man has to pretend to be the hero so that he can defeat the Dark Lord. So it was definitely a middle grade book. And since I had middle schoolers who were, like I said, I had 4 boys and 1 girl. My boys were always complaining about what book to read next. Like they said, go to the library and there's a lot of books on like romance and books for girls, and I don't see a lot of books for me. So I thought, I'm a writer. I think I can tackle that problem. So that book ended up being called The Not So Chosen One. So I'd written 3 books while I had my agent, and I actually wrote a 4th that Clean Team picked up that hasn't come out yet. Anyway, I did quite well, actually. She sent out some proposals, and I got a lot of requests for my books. But what happened is when I submitted The Not So Chosen One to her, she went through and she basically wanted me to rewrite the entire book with a different plot and make it much darker. It was supposed to be very humorous and funny for kids. She wanted it darker. She wanted me to kill the kid's dad halfway through. She said that was non-negotiable. And there were just things that she asked me to do that I couldn't do to that book. And if I had done it, I would not feel proud putting my name on the book. So we ended up parting ways. We still keep in touch with each other. She ended up moving away, and we still talk to each other. She's a writer also, so we will Zoom and do writing stuff together. But I think we both decided that friends and agents don't mix. After I parted ways with her, I ended up publishing all 3 books, The Seventh Fly, Vampire, and Not So Chosen One, a couple months after I parted ways with her. All with different publishers who didn't require agents. And it actually turned out to go really well because this publisher for The Seventh Fly, Babylon Books, it's run by William Bernhardt, my writing mentor that I had told you about. And he's done a really nice job. So that was kind of my journey in publishing. It's still ongoing. Right now I'm working on another middle grade book called The Galaxy Road, which is kind of Star Wars with dragons. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, where I'm going to publish it. Maybe I'll self-publish it. I haven't self-published anything yet, and I've kind of been looking at self-publishing and thinking, you know, there really are some advantages to self-publishing. So I don't know, maybe it'll be the first one that I try to self-publish. I was also thinking of getting an agent again, but I'm not quite sure if I'm ready for that. I don't know. We'll see. Y'all invite me here next year, and maybe I'll have the sequel to this story. I don't feel like there is a clear-cut answer in publishing as this is the best way to go. You need to go this way, because I feel like there's pluses and minuses with any direction you go. So I'm wanting to give you some recommendations for books that I have read on the craft of writing that I feel like were really helped me and will help anybody, no matter what stage of the process of writing you're in. I still go back and I read these books and use as reference. The first one is called Story Structure, and that one's by William Bernhardt. It's a short book, but it's a really useful book in terms of how to structure your novel. When I said I wrote that 11-page outline before I wrote my first book, it was a good outline and it helped me write my whole book. But this book, Story Structure, really helps you see where to put your beginning, middle, and end, where your inciting incident goes, plot point 1, plot point 2, your climax. It'll just go through and explain it all in a really easy to understand manner. Like I said, it's a short book. There's not a lot of like verbiage, or it doesn't go into a lot of unnecessary detail. It's straight to the point. So I really recommend that one. And he has, I think, 9 or 10 books in this series, in his writing series. Story Structure is the first book, but the workshops that I attended that were, you know, kind of pricey for me, especially at the time, all of his notes from those workshops are in these books, which are like 99 cents on Amazon. So yeah, I put Story Structure on here because it's the first one of his Story of How to Write series, but really all of those books, you know, if you really want to dig into the craft of writing, that's a great way to go. The second one is, actually the second 2 books are 2 of the books that my husband got me that first Christmas after I wrote my first book, and they're really good, so I still recommend them. The first one is called The First 5 Pages by Noah Lukeman. And this is the book where I read it and I was like, okay, I'm making that mistake on adverbs, I'm making that mistake on adjectives, I'm making this mistake on viewpoint. And then the last book is called Characters and Viewpoint by Orson Scott Card. And that one was really eye-opening because my idea on viewpoint was, well, does it really matter if you stay in one viewpoint or not, you know? Then I read that book and I'm like, yes, it does matter. So really the genre got started with J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It was really the first fantasy book that people had seen, even though I would argue there were other, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You know, that was kind of a horror book, but it did have fantasy elements. So, and like even in Shakespeare, you can find, you know, fairies and Midsummer's Night Dream, you know, things like that. So there's elements of fantasy that even go back. I would argue, you know, even Greek mythology has a lot of fantasy in it. But really the first modern day fantasy writer is considered by most is J.R.R. Tolkien. And I think when The Lord of the Rings came out, it was you know, really different. And I feel like he's kind of the one who set the tone for fantasy for the next century or so. A lot of writers took after him, and kind of these genre tropes of fantasy kind of started with him, with having like this grizzly old wizard with the long beard and coming to the young orphan boy who has this great destiny. And in his case, they were hobbits, but The Winsome Future King was a really good representation of the whole hero's journey. So that's I made fun of it in the Not So Chosen One of all these tropes that have been overused over and over and over again. So in the Not So Chosen One, he decides he's going to go on his own quest. He's going to make up a quest. And in the world that they live in, they have dragons, but their dragons are lazy and they live in zoos. So he has to go to the zoo and try to convince a dragon to leave and go on a quest that may end in death. And the dragon is like, I'm sitting here in the zoo. I have meals 3 times a day, and you want me to leave? So it's his job to try to convince the dragon to go on the quest with him. And then he needs a magical sword, but during the time that the book takes place, most magical swords have become real mouthy and sarcastic. So he ends up with this mouthy, sarcastic sword that never wants to do what he wants to do and is always criticizing his every move. So anyway, yeah, I put a lot of humor in it. I've read a lot of fantasy, and I've read a lot of those books that have the trope of the hero's journey, basically the young boy going with the wizard and then ending up, you know, confronting the Dark Lord and saving the world. So in my book, I kind of just poke fun at all the lighthearted humor. I'm not mean or anything about it, but it was really fun to write. It's got a sequel coming up too, so at some point that one will come out. So after The Lord of the Rings, there have been a lot of other authors who followed in the footsteps of J.R.R. Tolkien. One of my favorite modern day fantasy authors is one called Brandon Sanderson. He's extremely prolific, extremely successful. I was invited to go to a Comic-Con in Kansas City, and I didn't know anything about it. All they said is they needed somebody to come be on this panel at a Comic-Con. Well, I thought it was going to be kind of a small deal. I didn't know anything about it. And I got there, and it was in downtown Kansas City. It was this huge convention center. There was no parking anywhere. I drove around for 45 minutes, finally found parking way out. By the time I had gotten there an hour early, but trying to find the parking made me get there 5 minutes late to the convention. And I walked into the room. There's the panelists. So it's in a room kind of like this. I walk in through a door like that, and at the back of the room, there's a table with all the panelists sitting there. The room was packed, and I had never seen that many people show up, you know, for an author panel before. And there was a man who looked very much like Brandon Sanderson sitting at the end of the table with an empty chair beside him. And I went up and I sat in the empty chair, and he leans over and gave me his hand and said, "Hi, I'm Brandon." And I'm like, I know who you are, in front of all these, you know, hundreds of people. Anyway, that was a really fun experience. Totally caught me off guard. Actually, the people who were on the panel didn't know he was going to be there either. It was really a last minute add-in. So they hadn't prepared me. They didn't let me know, or they couldn't have. They apologized to me afterwards. Like, we didn't know he was going to be here. So, you know, we apologize. But yeah, he is a really prolific fantasy author, and I feel like he took the fantasy genre and moved it forward. Kind of took out, you know, in one of his series called the Mistborn trilogy, the way that they use magic is they use metals, like metal alloys, for their magic system. like copper, bronze, silver, gold, they'll use coins made out of those types of metals as to use for their magical powers, or what you would call magical powers. So I feel like he really upgraded the fantasy genre. But there are a lot of really good fantasy authors. And this type of fantasy I would consider high fantasy. So in high fantasy, usually it's set in a medieval type world, usually has magic, usually has dragons. High fantasy oftentimes has a slow start because the author is trying to introduce you to this world that you've never seen before. A lot of times authors will get into the politics of the world, and if you can get through that slow start, it's a really fun read. But I do feel like high fantasy is kind of hard to read sometimes because of that setup phase, the first quarter of the novel. If you've read Robert Jordan, but the first book, I remember it just took me a while to get into it because he's setting up, you got to set up all the characters and what their world is like, and you have to explain the politics of the world, and so there's some pluses and minuses to high fantasy. I feel like if you're jumping into high fantasy for the first time, you just need to know that it does get good, but you kind of have to wade through the first half of it to kind of figure out what's going on in the world. Once you figure that out, then it really gets fun. The next one is urban fantasy. So for urban fantasy, it's usually set on Earth in an urban setting. And the plot can have romance, but the plot does not rely very heavily on the romance. And now the reason why I was saying Harry Potter could be urban fantasy is because it starts out in London. So when he's in London interacting with people there, that's urban fantasy. When he gets to Hogwarts, that's more high fantasy. So that's kind of a blend of genres. And I honestly, if I had to classify it, I would just call it middle grade fantasy. At least for the first couple books. And then by the end of the books, I would call it young adult fantasy. A lot of times you'll have a detective, like for example, Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. He's a wizard, modern day wizard living in Chicago, and he's this. He's a really funny guy. The author is the humor really comes through the books, but it has magic, but it's modern day set in Chicago. So that would be urban fantasy. And there's like if you think Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a lot of urban fantasy and paranormal romance, which we'll talk about next, typically has vampires and werewolves, kind of mythological type creatures. Not always, but a lot of times it has that aspect to it. For urban fantasy, really though, it really relies on the plot and the story. A lot of times it does have romance, but that's kind of just a sub-story. It doesn't depend on the romance to carry it through. And so the very close cousin of urban fantasy is paranormal romance, where the plot does rely on the romantic element. And if you didn't have that romantic element, then there would be no plot. Like the plot is, how are these two people going to get together? So a lot of times that's vampires and humans falling in love, werewolves and humans, angels and demons falling in love. You've ever heard of the Charlene Harris or Nalini Singh? Those are both really prolific, notable paranormal romance authors. So these two genres, urban fantasy and paranormal romance, have actually been doing really well lately, especially on Amazon and Kindle. There's kind of a spectrum. So you have urban fantasy with absolutely no romance, and you have paranormal romance where the only point of the plot is the romance. And there's kind of this happy middle where you've got a fair dose of romance, but not too much to overtake the plot. So that happy middle seems to be where the most books are selling. it doesn't always have to be a city setting. It is called urban fantasy, but I feel like that is kind of a general idea. To me, urban fantasy means more like, I would probably call it more modern day fantasy. So I feel like if it takes place here on Earth during our time in a setting that we're familiar with, I think you could still call it urban fantasy, even though it may not be set in a big city. Like for Alana Andrews's, she has a magic series. It's set in Atlanta, but the idea is that Atlanta has fallen. The whole Earth has gone through this magical shift, and the buildings have all collapsed, and it's kind of a doomsday Atlanta. And it's still set in Atlanta. There's still some landmarks that are recognizable, but the population of Atlanta is, about like the population of Hutchinson or something. So, so it's not the same Atlanta that we're familiar with. So yeah, I would say even if it's not set in a big, like for this book, it starts out in Houston, and so I call it urban fantasy. But halfway through the book, they go back to Faithander, which is more of a high fantasy world. So it's kind of a blend, and you can have those blends in genres. Most readers are fine with it because most readers who read fantasy read from high fantasy to paranormal romance. Not all the time. Sometimes you'll find readers who are just going to read urban fantasy and nothing else, or just going to read high fantasy and nothing else. For me, I just like to read. I love to read fantasy, but if it's a mystery book, I'm not going to pass it up just because, or if it's a thriller or, whatever, I like to read. But I don't know, maybe that's not normal for all readers. I'm definitely I write way more than I read, but I still try to read quite a bit so that I feel like it helps my writing if I read more, because I can see, and if you read a wide variety of authors also, I feel like that helps your writing style, and you can see things you like and see things you don't like about other authors' writing. Now, and I forgot to say also, there's high fantasy, urban, and paranormal romance. Those are three of the major fantasy genres that right now are the biggest bestsellers. But as you know, on Amazon, they have categories after categories after, subgenres, subgenres. So get really nitpicky with, what exactly happens in this book, and then classify it into all these different genres. And we could be here till 5 in the evening if I went over every single category in Kindle and all the genres and subgenres. But I wanted to pick the main three that I think are the most well-known, just because I feel like, you need to be familiar with what's really selling. So, okay, first you got to decide what kind of world is it going to be in. Is it going to be in a high fantasy, urban fantasy, or paranormal? Urban fantasy and paranormal romance will probably be in a similar setting. A high fantasy, I have friends and other writers who will spend years and 100 pages just creating the world with no plot. It's just the world. Yeah. For me, that's a little extreme. I don't really write high fantasy. The closest I got was this series, which had a little bit of high fantasy, and I got to create a world in it. But I basically based it on Earth and based it on Earth with magic. So if you want to make a high fantasy, then some questions you need to answer. What kind of geography is in your world? So, which could be a really broad question. Does it have deserts? Does it have oceans, islands, mountains, volcanoes? A lot of fantasy authors will create an entire map of their world to keep all these different places straight. Does it have a lot of cities? Is it mostly just towns? And then that leads into what's the government structure. So for high fantasy, this could take ages for you to, you're basically creating an entire world from scratch. And if that's what you like to do, then go for it. Some people they would rather just create this world than write the book set in the world. So they'll come up with this really cool world, and then the other one is the magic system, and that's the whole, and the creatures. What kind of, do you have dragons in this world? Do you have fairies? Do you have elves? Are they all humans with magic? That's the nice thing about fantasy, is you can just let your imagination run wild. You can create your own kind of characters. Maybe they're not any type of creature that we're familiar with, and you come up with your own name for these types of creatures that are in this world. My husband and kids have been playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons lately, and they come up with all these fantastical creatures and characters and settings, and so that's kind of a good way to figure out how to. And they even make maps. They'll have maps that they'll draw of all these different places that they go. So that's high fantasy. For urban fantasy, you don't have to put as much detail into urban fantasy. You could say it's set in Wichita, but 5% of the population has magic or something. Or there's a group of vampires living underground. Or you've got a detective who has a magical cat or something, So urban fantasy is really fun also, and you can really have a lot of leeway with how you want to pattern your urban fantasy. And it doesn't, even though it is called urban fantasy, it doesn't necessarily, like we said earlier, doesn't necessarily have to be in a big city. It could be a smaller town or something but in order to be called urban fantasy, there has to be a fantastical element, even if it's just something kind of small. Right, Alice in Wonderland, it has a fantastical element, so it would be fantasy. She falls down the rabbit hole and she enters this, fantastical world with all these different things in it. I don't know if I would call it urban fantasy. I would probably just classify that as, if we were classifying it nowadays, I would probably call it middle grade fantasy. If you go online and type in Alice in Wonderland, you'll see there'll probably be a couple of different genres that it pops up in. Classics is probably one too. Now, I forgot to say one thing. This book is more science fiction. It has a lot of advanced technology in it, even though it's still considered a fantasy, kind of like Star Wars. There's this line between science fiction and fantasy that's really blurry. And sometimes it's hard to know what side, is it science fiction, is it fantasy? My way that I've always defined it is whatever different thing is happening in your world, is it fueled by magic or is it technology? So if you think of Star Trek, that's technology. They use technology. They use spaceships that are flying with technological advances, warp drive that we don't have currently. So that's science fiction. And if you look at Star Wars, they've got the Force, which is more kind of they don't call it magic, but it's more of a magical type energy that they use. So in my own definition, I would say science fiction is just if you use technology to power something, or in fantasy is if you use magic. So maybe somebody else defines it differently than me, but there has to be a definition somewhere. And I think my writing, I do blend science fiction and fantasy quite a bit. Even in my Fairy World MD series, my elves have technology. At one point they had magic, but now they use more technology. They use magic as the fuel for their technology, but they've also incorporated a lot of science into their civilization. I'm writing a book right now. It's a middle grade book called The Galaxy Road. And I've got spaceships that are pulled, the dragons pull the spaceships down the road. So I have no idea what genre it is. Right now I'm calling it science fantasy. So I don't know, that's an interesting topic. I think I belong to some writing groups on Facebook, and I think I'm going to pose that question. What genre is this if you have spaceships that are being drawn by dragons? Okay, and then paranormal romance, it's basically the same kind of setting as urban fantasy. Usually paranormal romance is set on Earth, but Earth, there's some kind of either mythological creatures that live on Earth, or there's some kind of magical aspect that has changed Earth just a little bit. But to be considered paranormal romance, it's got to, we've already talked about this, but it's got to rely on the romance element to carry it.